When you hear the word vampire, what first springs to mind? For many, the tale of a twisted creature with an insatiable lust for blood may at first seem fanciful, preserved only for the works of fiction. But on further inspection, the taboo ritual of consuming human blood has a long and storied history, and for one young woman living in Stockholm, Sweden in 1932, the real horrors of vampirism may lead her towards a gruesome and untimely end. This is the true unsolved case of the Atlas vampire. Lilly Elizabeth Larson was born in Malmö, Sweden on August 29, 1900. She came from a very large family, being the eldest of 10 children. Lilly married young to a merchant sometime in her late teens, but unfortunately the couple didn't last. At 22, she moved to the capital, Stockholm, looking to move on from her old relationship and establish a new life for herself. For a while, things were good. The 20s were a time of great optimism and opportunity, with the world racing forwards towards a brighter future, eager to move on from the vast horrors and inhumanity of World War I. Lilly made new friends and reinvented herself in this brave new world, but unfortunately, like all good things, this couldn't last. If the 20s epitomised new hope, the 30s that followed embodied grievous hardship. With tension once again rising in Europe and the onset of the Great Depression, many people were forced to adapt to survive, including Lilly. Now in her early 30s, her circumstances forced her into prostitution, which was not an uncommon occurrence at the time for women desperate to avoid finding themselves thrown out onto the streets. All things considered, however, the ever-resilient Lilly was able to do quite well for herself. Although she lived in Atlas, which was at the time considered a rather undesirable neighbourhood, she kept a good relationship with her landlady, an older woman called Ruth Johnson, which kept her rent low. Having somewhat of a disposable income, Lilly was known to occasionally splurge on more luxurious items, owning both her personal radio and her own telephone, which was certainly not common at the time. She would often entertain her neighbours and invite them round to listen to the broadcasts, which made her quite popular, while the telephone allowed her to avoid having to stand for hours on the cold streets to advertise herself. Instead, Lilly had quite the loyal clientele, who would phone her to arrange meetings, most often held in her studio apartment. Although her life wouldn't have been considered easy in any way, she was making the most of it, and the people that knew her best regarded Lilly as a rather sanguine and upbeat character. Even though her profession enabled her to live a more flexible lifestyle with a modest income and considerable amount of free time, it was also accompanied by a number of risks, and was particularly dangerous. And on a chilly spring evening, Lilly was about to be confronted with this fact. It was Walpurgis Night, an annual holiday celebrated in Sweden to honour Saint Walpurga. In Stockholm, fireworks would light up the sky and large bonfires would be lit for people to gather around in celebration. Earlier that afternoon, Lilly stopped by her landlady's apartment to pay her rent for May in advance, staying for a coffee and a chat before inviting both Ruth and her husband to come and listen to a one-off radio broadcast at 9:30 that night for the Walpurgis celebrations. Lilly then met up with another one of her friends at Lilly's apartment, Mimi Jansen, so they could discuss their plans for that evening, when they were interrupted by the phone ringing. Lilly picked up the receiver and began to talk. On the other end of the line was a man who Mimi would later describe as sounding a nice and sober gentleman who seemed well behaved. The unknown man wanted to arrange a liaison with Lilly later that evening, asking if Lilly was available and explaining that he was nearby and would be over soon. Taking that as her cue to leave, Mimi collected her things and left Lilly to her work. Not long after, however, Mimi would hear a knock at her door. It was Lilly asking to borrow a condom. It was clear that the man on the phone had arrived. After a brief interaction, Lilly returned to her apartment. Only a few minutes later, however, Lilly would again knock on the door, this time wearing only an overcoat and boots, asking again to borrow a condom. This wasn't entirely unusual. Both Mimi and Lilly were in the same line of business, and this kind of exchange was often used as a way for women to check in on each other throughout the night. Later that night, Ruth and her husband telephoned ahead to let Lilly know that they would be round soon to listen to the radio broadcast, but even after a few attempts, she didn't pick up. When they arrived at 9:30 and knocked on the door, they also received no response. At 9:45, Mimi made her way up to Lilly's apartment herself, expecting Lilly to have finished with her client and hoping they could enjoy at least some of the Walpurgis festivities together. Lilly's door was locked from the inside, and when Mimi knocked, she got no reply. Mimi left shortly after to enjoy the celebrations herself, still hopeful that she might bump into her friend at the bonfire later that evening. After a night of celebrations, however, Mimi still hadn't seen Lilly at any of their frequented clubs or at the bonfire celebrations, So upon returning home, she tried her door again and still got no answer. Whoever this unknown client was, it seemed he was certainly getting his money's worth. Over the next 2 days, however, Lilly was still nowhere to be seen, with the frequent calls to her telephone now going unanswered. After a male friend of Lilly showed up to check on her and also had no luck, he and Mimi, now deeply concerned, went to Ruth the landlady for help, who recounted the events of Walpurgis night and how she too hadn't heard anything from Lilly for days. After some deliberation, with everyone aware of Lilly's illegal line of work, they decided to get in touch with the police. Officer Nordstrom of the Stockholm police was first on the scene and, with the help of a local fireman, was able to force open the door. They were greeted with a gruesome sight, and everyone's worst fears were confirmed. Lilly Lindstrom had been brutally murdered. With detectives arriving quickly on the scene, the sight they were presented with was a strange one. Lilly lay face down, naked on the bed, with 3 cushions piled on her back. Her head, from the temple down, had been completely caved in by a number of violent blows. The police district physician concluded that the weapon was likely a pipe, wrench or crowbar. Judging by the severity of the injury, it had to have some considerable heft, or was wielded with an abnormal amount of force. A matted pool of blood had formed at the base of the bed on a rug, which by this point had already coagulated and dried up. It seemed she had been dead for some time, with early evidence pointing to on or just after Walpurgis night. The rest of the apartment, however, was nearly spotless, with there being no sign of a struggle. Lilly's clothes were neatly folded on a chair next to the bed, and everything seemed largely untouched. Thus, police quickly ruled out robbery as a motive, with her purse still full and even expensive items like the radio and telephone left exactly where they should have been. The only real oddity in the rest of the apartment was a blood-soaked tea towel left discarded in the sink. With seemingly no sign of the murder weapon and nothing missing from the apartment, it was likely that the killer had brought the weapon with them, implying that it was premeditated. Upon further inspection of the corpse, a used condom was found protruding from between her legs, and a disturbing amount of human saliva was found on her neck. Was Lilly murdered in the middle of a sex act as part of someone's abhorrent fantasy? It was a theory that seemed plausible, and led by Chief Alvar Zetterquist, it was what the police ran with. Unfortunately, this kind of thing would happen more often than most would like to believe. But this is where things start to get particularly strange. According to some sources, Lilly's body was exceptionally pale, so much so in fact that at the time, some proposed that she had been exsanguinated, completely drained of her blood. While evidence supporting this claim is spotty at best, it was considered odd that apart from the pool on the floor and the towel found in the sink, that the apartment was largely free of any bloodstains. This, along with the saliva found on her neck, raises a conceivably fanciful proposition, one that the police at the time certainly didn't buy into. Was this crime somehow vampiric in nature? It's a terrifying thought, and one the local newspapers would soon have a field day with. Lilly's death was about to get extremely sensationalized. Sometime after midnight, Lilly's body was removed from the apartment and was later buried in her hometown of Malmö on the 16th of May. Police initially held out that the killer may suffer a crisis of conscience and come forward in the coming days, but after several weeks of silence, that idea was dismissed. It seemed the killer, whoever they were, was comfortable in what they had done. Working on the presumption that Lilly had been killed by a patron, police began working their way through her clientele, using a series of business cards found in her apartment as a base. But unfortunately this bore no fruit, with each of the regulars ruled out one by one. Police also made extensive inquiries in the local area of Sankt Eriksplan, but given Lilly's profession and the details of the case, it's understandable that very few came forward with information. Suspiciously, a nearby apartment to Lilly's was burgled the night after her death, with a young woman waking up at around 5 AM to find a strange man inside her home attempting to access a locked storage box. The man was wearing a suit and quickly attempted to muffle the woman, but she escaped and ran down onto the street screaming, where she caught the attention of a patrol officer. By the time they had returned to the apartment, however, the thief was gone. Although certainly strange, police dismissed this as being connected to Lilly's murder, citing that they didn't think robbery had played a factor in her death. It does certainly seem odd for someone to murder a woman in one apartment, leave all of her belongings untouched, and then break into an adjacent one to commit a robbery. No witnesses could be found who saw any men leaving or arriving at the apartments after the time of death, with Ruth the landlady only recalling that around 5 separate men may have been in and out earlier that evening. But given what a number of the women in the complex did for a living, this is par for the course. A young waitress working at a local cafe called Norma's, which was located on the ground floor of the apartment's block, did come forward with a rather intriguing piece of information. According to her, a man had come in around 9 PM on Walpurgis night carrying a porcelain container, a container that the waitress recognised as belonging to Lilly, who had often frequented the cafe. He seemed polite, ordered 2 steak dinners and then left. Police were never able to determine a positive identification for this man, and it remains a curious loose thread. A few days after Lilly's death, Ruth Johnson, the landlady, received a telegram from a man staying in Copenhagen, who had seemingly just recently heard about her death. The man worked as a waiter in Stockholm usually, and police were eventually able to track down his 2 brothers for questioning. They discovered that Lilly and this man had an unusual relationship, with Lilly being somewhat captivated by him, expressing her love for him on a number of occasions. However, nothing was ever made official between them. His brothers explained that they had all been together playing poker on the night of Lilly's murder, and when asked, Mimi too said that she was aware of Lilly's infatuation with him and confirmed that he had not been the man who had called Lilly on the evening of her death. Once again, it seemed that the police had struck out. After some time, a woman came forwards to the police, worried that her husband, a local pimp only known as Pettersson, could have been involved in the murder. Apparently he had come home on the night of the murder covered in bloodstains and refused to explain to his wife where they had come from. When he was questioned by the police, he was able to come up with a shaky alibi, backed up by a supposed business partner of his. There's a chance that Pettersson could have been involved. It's safe to say that whatever he had been up to during the Walpurgis celebration seemed far from legal, but lacking any real evidence, he was eventually dropped as a suspect. Around a month and a half after Lilly's death, a soup ladle covered in blood was discovered on the street near the apartment block. Seemingly too light to have been the murder weapon in Lilly's case, the police were not quite sure what to make of it. This didn't stop the newspapers, however, and soon stories that the ladle had been used by the murderer to drink from Lilly's blood were rampant. By this point, speculation on the death had reached a fever pitch, with the ladle just the next in a long line of things that hungry reporters had latched onto. With the police struggling to make any headway on the case, conspiracy theories surrounding the killer's identity and alleged supernatural abilities were left largely unchallenged, and soon the legend of the vampire murderer of Atlas was born. At the time, vampires were very present in popular culture, with Universal's famed horror classic Dracula only released a few months before to great critical and commercial success. It's safe to say that among a certain segment of the population, vampirism was very much on the mind and made for paper-selling, hair-raising reading. Police were still hopeful that something would lead to a break in the case, maybe a new piece of evidence or another witness coming forward, but nothing ever materialised. Worried that this killing would be the first of many, for a time the police remained vigilant, but it seemed that the Atlas vampire never struck again. As time went on, as always, the attention of the police was diverted elsewhere, and the case was eventually closed, remaining unsolved. Since then, a number of theories have been put forward over the years as to the killer's identity. The first and most obvious idea is that Lilly was murdered by one of her clients, likely the man on the phone who had called earlier that evening. For what reason is unknown, but police theorised at the time that the killer struck in the middle of a sex act from behind. He then would have slipped out of the building unnoticed sometime during the night. It seems likely that the killer could even have been present in the room still when both Ruth and Mimi had come knocking. Some have also suggested that the killer could have been a police officer, with the murder weapon likely a baton. He would have had an idea of what the police would have been looking for, and so made a great effort to go over the apartment before leaving, arranging the strange scene as an attempt to throw his colleagues off. If the claims of exsanguination are in fact accurate, that would certainly narrow down the possible list of suspects, as it would require a great deal of knowledge to properly drain the victim of such a significant amount of blood. Someone with a profession as a doctor or mortician would certainly fit the bill, but police never suspected anyone with an appropriate background. With no puncture wound found on the body, and the fact that the newspapers were so keen to sensationalise every detail of the case, it seemed likely that the claims that Lilly had been drained carefully of her vital fluids by a skilled practitioner with a lust for blood are probably not credible. Sadly, more than anything, this is the kind of case which would be easily solvable with today's modern practices and equipment. The scene of the crime, which police at the time had found to be devoid of any real evidence, was in fact drowning in DNA, something investigators of the era were clueless to know about. Almost 90 years on from the murder, any hopes of truly identifying a culprit have long since faded, with the true identity of the Atlas vampire likely to remain a mystery for the foreseeable future.